Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Pierce, and I'm the President and CEO of the Community Foundation of Mississauga. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's Vital Conversation. Vital Conversations is an ongoing series where we draw inspiration from our findings in our Vital Signs report and focus on issues facing our community. Acknowledging the extraordinary times, we are currently presenting the series Vital Conversations in COVID-19 Times. The global pandemic continues to affect our world in unforeseen ways. Our sector has had to be nimble. Our work is too important to do anything but access funding and resources as we continue to work to provide critical programs and services to the region's most vulnerable. Your work is vital to our community, and you will long be remembered for your response, both individually and collectively, as you serve the needs of our community. Your leadership through the pandemic is inspiring. Today's session is the third of our four-part series, Vital Conversations in COVID-19 Times. This series is meant to examine and support our sector as it contends with the impact of the pandemic. Today's session is Future Ready, Cultivating the Conditions for a Thriving Charitable Sector Beyond COVID, with an exceptional panel and moderator. I am pleased to acknowledge those that made today's session possible. The Community Leadership Committee, chaired by Helen Seibel, Tara Addis, Catherine Bouis, Rajesh Dixit, Gurpreet Malhotra, Paula Harvey, Tanya Mashinsky, Merle Zorb, and Sadat Zuberi, Grants and Community Initiatives Manager Lorraine Crow, and Administrator Pauline Pabesma. Before I introduce today's moderator, it is my pleasure to thank Leith Wheeler Investment Council. Leith Wheeler is a friend and partner to the Community Foundation sector, and we were fortunate to receive a grant from the Vital Conversations powered by Leith Wheeler grant program in support of today's session. I would now like to introduce today's moderator, Tara Addis. With more than 20 years of corporate, not-for-profit, and public management experience, Tara has designed, developed, and implemented award-winning community engagement and communications programs. She has also worked with leading companies to create effective stakeholder engagement, public affairs, and health solutions teams, policies, and practices. Tara is currently operating her own stakeholder engagement and public affairs consulting practice, working with clients that range from senior leaders in the pharmaceutical, transportation, and energy industries to the not-for-profit, health, and social service sectors. Additionally, Tara is a faculty advisor for the St. Michael's College Corporate Social Responsibility Program at the University of Toronto, where she developed the corporate community investment and involvement curriculum. In 2002, Tara was awarded the Queen's Golden Jubilee Medal, recognizing her contribution to Canada and her community. Please welcome Tara Addis.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for your kind comments. Really appreciate it. I am delighted to introduce our esteemed panelists who will inspire us to think about how we respond to COVID today while reimagining tomorrow. To begin, I would like to introduce Andrea Dix, the President of the Community Foundations of Canada. Andrea brings 15 years of community and corporate philanthropy experience, including as the founding executive director of the Community Foundation of Greater Peterborough. She also served in leadership roles with the Rideau Hall Foundation, PwC Canada Foundation, and the Make-A-Wish Foundation. Working closely with Canada's 191 community foundations, which is remarkable. I can't believe it's grown to that level at this point, Andrea. Andrea is helping to strengthen philanthropy's impact by being a vocal advocate for the role of community-driven solutions to pressing global changes and challenges. Andrea has played a central role in the launch of groundbreaking Canadian and international initiatives, including the Equality Fund, which is transforming how organizations and movements working to advance women's rights and gender equality are supported. So highly interesting. Welcome, Andrea. We're so pleased to have you. Next, I am very pleased to introduce Karen Wilson, partner at KCI Ketchum Canada. Karen brings a unique mix of knowledge and skill to her role as partner. Not only does Karen provide superior strategic direction and project management, she also serves as a mentor and leader, arming clients with tools and necessary ability to achieve long-term success in their development initiatives. Since joining the firm, Karen has served as an advisor and coach to many KCI staff and clients, helping them to realize their fundraising goals. I'd like to congratulate you, Karen. You recently received the ACFRE designation from the Association of Fundraising Professionals, being one of only 9 to hold this title in Canada. Very well done. Karen is an avid volunteer serving on several boards of directors. Thank you so much for joining us, Karen. And finally, I am excited to introduce Stephen Eyre. Stephen is the CEO of Common Good Strategies, a social impact research firm. He is a social strategist, a data scientist, and a public speaker. Combining his extensive management and social impact experience, Stephen leads projects that bring a wealth of knowledge and networks to clients seeking a catalyzed strategy for inclusion, philanthropy, CSR, and nonprofit innovation. He is a recognizable analyst and voice of the nonprofit sector. Stephen currently serves as lead researcher and author on the Toronto Foundation Vital Signs Report and the Imagine Canada Community Investment Stream of Research. Stephen was the past chair of Endeavor Volunteer Consulting for Nonprofits and is currently a professor in the Nonprofit and Social Sector Management Program at Seneca College. So glad that you're able to join us, Stephen. Welcome. At this time, I would also like to ask our guests who have joined us, and I've seen you all zooming in now, which is fabulous. We're so pleased that you're here, to use that chat box. I see that you are, to introduce yourselves to one another and also pose questions for our panelists. So we will be watching those as we proceed with our hour together, and look forward to your commentary and your questions. Now we have lots and lots to talk about, so why don't we get started and just jump right in. Stephen, perhaps we can start our conversation with you. You recently had the opportunity to consult a very wide array of stakeholders while researching the Imagine Canada Wake-Up Call report. What are 2 or 3 changes that you have seen unfold in the not-for-profit sector since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, Stephen?
Yeah, thank you. Number one change that we saw in terms of the nonprofit sector was just how severely hit it's been. Imagine Canada just last week released an update to its sector monitor resource, which surveyed over 1,000 charities, asking them about the financial impact of the pandemic. About half of charities reported that the revenue had declined, and the average decline they reported was about a 43% decline in revenue. I mean, when you look at that compared to almost any other industry or sector, I mean, the decline in revenue in the nonprofit sector has just been really and truly huge and almost unprecedented. It's at the same level you might expect of like a hotel chain or, you know, a restaurant. And I think those have gotten a lot of attention in the media, but I think the sheer decline of revenue in the nonprofit sector hasn't got as much attention. And unlike every other industry, more than half of charities are reporting that their demand for services is increasing. So even though the revenue is going down more than it's ever gone down in any point in their history, at the same time, more and more people are actually going to charities looking for help, whether it's around food security, mental health, housing, homelessness. These issues are all surging while the ability to respond to them has declined. And really that strain between increasing demand and declining revenue is really driving so many different parts of the changes we're seeing in the nonprofit sector. In the midst of that, like when we look at Toronto specifically, Toronto has had growing inequality for quite a long time, and I think it's received quite a bit of attention. For the Toronto Foundation's Vital Signs report, one of the things we highlighted was the United Way's report recently, where they highlighted that white Toronto residents had seen their income go up by about 60%, adjusting for inflation over the last 35 years or so, whereas racialized Toronto residents had only seen their income go up by 1% over that same 35-year period. And in the midst of that, we saw disproportionately during the pandemic, racialized folks were far more likely to lose their jobs far more likely to not be able to pay their rent and otherwise pay their bills. So this combination of, there's really particular populations that have been struggling for a long time in Canada, and this has really taken that up and cranked it to an entirely different level. And nonprofits are often on the front line of being able to work and serve with those organizations. And I think the other piece is really like looking at, like, there's many organizations that are in very particularly challenging financial situations. People have now tapped into financial reserves. They've laid off staff if they could. Many times the government's wage subsidy program has provided absolutely essential relief, but it's still not quite sufficient to be able to cope with the level of decrease. And we've seen recently major institutions do some, like Laurentian University declared, they were insolvent. And I was going through some pretty major changes trying to figure out how they're going to continue to be able to stay open. This YMCA of Greater Toronto recently announced it was selling its Mississauga Center of Community right downtown. It's been obviously a key organization and entity in Peel for a very long time. And like, these are the sorts of things that, organizations like the YMCA, it's great that they had that asset and that I was able to sell it to be able to, keep the organization alive and thriving. But a lot of the small organizations in particular don't have that sort of capacity. They don't have those reserves. They don't have those options. So we're seeing, about a quarter of small organizations in particular, which tend to be more likely to be BIPOC-led, grassroots, locally in the community, working on the most critical issues. These are the ones that are disproportionately at risk of saying they're going to be closing.
It certainly seems like there's been tremendous change, shifts, and that COVID has really been a tipping point for so many of these changes and challenges, Stephen. Karen, I know that also KCI examined some of the shifts that are happening currently as a response to COVID, and that they're, again, looking at how those changes are unfolding. What might the charitable organizations, and many on the call today, undertake to fortify their resilience and to safeguard their operations in the face of what Stephen has described so eloquently?
Absolutely. And we all know that this has been a huge challenge for the not-for-profit sector. So I'm going to use 4 words to answer this question, but I'm going to frame it in the one thing about our sector is that we are survivors. So when we kind of look to the future, all organizations, especially our smaller charities, so there's a need here. So how do we make sure we can service that need? So there's something just innate in who we are as a sector and the type of work we do. We all want to take care of people. So we can kind of become rooted in that. This is the time. So the 4 words, I'm going to start with strategy. I'm going to then talk about what messaging and what case we're telling the community, what's our overall story, continue conversations, and focus on digital. So those 4 words, but I'm going to come back to strategy. This is where we, as every organization, have to do our soul searching. We all know we were started for a reason, to meet a need. And what does that look like in today's context? So, and it's going to be a good news story because all of you meet such important needs in the community. I know, Renee, you're on here. When I think about the extra pressure on the Peel Children's Aid Society and on organizations like ARMA Women's Services and many of the community groups, note, as Stephen said, at this time you're needed more than ever. So recognizing the position that you're in. It is critical now, as we talk about case and messaging, to be letting the world know how valuable you are, what you're planning to do, and how you're going to be approaching the future. So being clear on what your messages are and what people need to hear right now, and then building on that. The big word is conversation. Many of us, many boards will say right now, is this really the time for us to be out talking about our organizations and talking about our need for funds? I'm going to unequivocally say, yes, it is, because people are people. And what do we all hear from our donor base? We hear, what can I do to help? And in many situations, some of our wealthier people, Stephen talked about how some people are doing well, other people aren't. Let's reach out to those because we did hear, and I know we had the president of Dartmouth College in our big KCI Big Rethink said there are certainly people right now who are feeling very fortunate to have positions and are in a position to give back. So this is the time to be saying to them, this is how you can help. So have conversations with people, let them know your situation. What we did find with many charities is their donors were genuinely, they're invested in you. They want you to do well. They wanted to know how you were coping through this time and what your strategies are for the future. So we've talked strategy, our messaging, continue those conversations, be bold, let people know what you need. And then finally, for all of us, as we're experiencing today, doing this talk via Zoom, that investment in digital and using the tools that are available to us right now in a pandemic and becoming comfortable with them will be a key for future success. So those are the four key points, Tara, that I'd say for charitable organizations to be thinking about in becoming resilient through this time.
Certainly, they are telling and quite specific, really. I mean, when you go back to strategy and how you anchor and start to grow and seed resilience. Thinking about resilience, Andrea, and building on this concept of anchoring it. In our earlier conversations, you noted that the charitable sector rapidly responded to the needs of communities they serve. How has this timely response, this compassionate response, changed the way Canadians perceive the sector?
Thanks, Tara. Hi, everyone. Before I dive into that really, really wonderful question, I just want to express my gratitude for the invitation to be here with all of you today, to be in conversation, to be part of a vital conversation with the Community Foundation of Mississauga. Big thanks to the staff, the board, the community volunteers for the invitation and for bringing us all together to talk about building a future that is just, that is bright, and that is sustainable for all. So I am here today in my living room, as you can see, which is on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, which is also called Ottawa. So yes, we have a lot of snow today. It's snowing out there, but it is beautiful. And I'm just really pleased to be here with all of you today. So I want to dive into this question, which is about resilience, which is about perspective. And I want to draw back to something that Stephen said, where Stephen was talking about the decline in revenue for the charitable sector and how actually decline in revenue is happening across all sectors. We know that. I think at times we need a reminder like that COVID-19 is an all of us issue, that our perspectives are shifting on all things. COVID-19 is rooted in community. It is a systems issue, and systems is that key word, not just sectors. So we know through COVID-19 that the health and long-term care systems, as one example, have been poorly equipped to grapple with the significant shocks of an experience like the one we're all sharing. COVID-19 has also shone a light on the shortcomings of our current political and economic systems to the extent that they fail to address inequalities, and that those inequalities are now even more amplified because of this particular time in this crisis. And so as we are now entering or about to enter the second year of the pandemic, more and more the systems that we depend on, of which the charitable sector is connected to many of those systems are being stretched or are already at a breaking point. So I think that when it comes to the perspective or the perception of the charitable sector, there's two things that I want to focus on. One, and Tara, you touched on this, the important role within community that the sector plays, and how over the last year, that importance, that relevancy, that compassion, that kindness has been rooted in the support that we have been able to provide to Canadians. At Community Foundations of Canada, we in collaboration with the 191 community foundations, which is real, along with partners like all of you who are here today, with Canadians from coast to coast to coast. We witness every single day the tremendous way in which the charitable and the nonprofit sector shows up for its community. It shows up with knowledge and precision and hustle and expertise and creativity and care. And throughout this last year, that showing up, that standing up for community has only been heightened. An example that I want to give a shout out to is the Community Foundation of Mississauga, our host today, who was one of the organizations who helped to activate the Emergency Community Support Fund. The Community Foundation gave 65 grants to organizations that were supporting people in community who were experiencing vulnerability or heightened vulnerability because of COVID-19. That total, that 65 grants, is nearly $1.9 million. And that's a tremendous way in which the Community Foundation was able to show up and stand up for community. So the relevance and the importance of community is the first thing. The second thing is it's more of an opportunity that I'm optimistic about, I guess I would say, and that's the opportunity of shifting power. So community foundations, and I believe that innovations and solutions are best found in the community and that they are led by the community. So I'm optimistic that this is going to grow and that this perspective is shared, because we've seen glimmers of why it matters so much from over the last 12 months. So I want to define power, and I can't define it perfectly, but there's a book called New Power. It's by Jeremy Hyman's and Henry Timms. If you haven't yet read it, I recommend it. And this is how they define power. First, they define old power, and I'm going to read it specifically so I don't get it wrong. Old power works like currency. It is held by few. Once gained, it is jealously guarded, and the powerful have a substantial store of it to spend. It is closed, inaccessible, and leader-driven. It downloads and it captures. Whereas new power, shifted power, operates differently, like a current. It is made by many. It is open, participatory, and peer-driven. It uploads and it distributes. Like water or electricity, it's most forceful when it surges. The goal with new power is not to hoard it, but to channel it. And I share that because I think it's really important to acknowledge the responsibility that we have, in particular as funders, but the responsibility that we have to ensure that diverse voices are at the table when important decisions about the future are being made. That's what we mean by shifting power through philanthropy. And I think that as a sector, at least as funders, we have an opportunity to do this better. There's a report that came out in December, which I'll link to in the chat box, called Unfunded. It's a research report that's by the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities and Carleton University's Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership Program. It's excellent, and it paints a really important reality that the Canadian philanthropic sector has failed to support Black community members. In particular, it has failed to support the specific needs of Black communities in Canada. And so that is a demonstration of why shifting power can do better and why it needs to do better. I know, and I'm almost done here, Tara, I know that when we're in the midst of an emergency and we are struggling in all the ways that Stephen pointed out and that Karen spoke about, it is hard, it is really hard to go from looking down and inward to looking up and outward. But I think we're getting a really clear signal that the systems in which we live need reinvention and reimagination. And in order to do this successfully, I believe, we need to be prepared to be honest. We need to be thoughtful about the voices that we center. We need to share and shift power. And we need to be thoughtful about the actions that we take if we truly want to do what we've been talking about, which is building back better. I'll stop there.
Andrea, I have to say that quote is so moving. Thank you so much for sharing that. It really makes you just stop and think. And that idea of sharing and shifting power is really, it's so human and it's elemental, isn't it? It's really at the base of what we're having these vital conversations about. You also spoke about innovation and how at the grassroots, that co-creation of innovative ways of doing things can really spur taking us to post-COVID, taking us to a place maybe of recovery. Karen, perhaps at this juncture, panelists, we can give some thought to that, to grassroots solutions, to how we start to shift powers and create innovations from the grassroots. Karen, I'll start this round with you. I do encourage people who have joined us, please use that chat box and ask questions of the panelists. We will be going to that chat box shortly. Karen, perhaps some thoughts on, you've now worked with so many of the different organizations, many that are on the line today. Can you maybe provide a couple of examples of how charitable organizations have embraced innovation, particularly at the grassroots during COVID, and how funders maybe have encouraged them to pursue novel approaches to problem solving?
Yeah, and I think to you that your last point there, Tara, that funders are saying some great things to grassroots charities to say, we've seen a shift during the pandemic where many funders are saying, typically we'd like to give to something specific or give to a program. Right now, we want to see you exist. So they're giving to unrestricted. So that's been a nice change for many organizations who can use the much needed funds in the way that they know is best for them. We're also seeing many donors give locally. So local has become important. They want to see their own communities be sustainable. So as far as ideas that I've seen that have been so innovative, one particular organization during the summertime, so they were talking to their donors in April, May, decided over the summer that they were going to do 100 days of calling. And what they did was had conversations with their donors to ask them how they were doing, what they needed to know about the organization. It gave them all an opportunity to update their own databases, which we all know is a challenge for all of us, and to be able to get email addresses and understand how their donors wanted to be communicated with. But I can tell you that 100 days, and at times, there were two, there's like a teeter-totter. The up point is that people had time to chat and were willing to chat. Some people would say, which all of us in the charitable, why are you calling me now? So there was that interesting balance. So you'd have a few calls where people were so happy to hear from you, and then another person questioning why you were calling. But overall, just that connection and that learning opportunity in reaching out to those supporters, I thought that was very innovative. Just get on the phone, chat, see what's going to happen. As many organizations shifted, we saw people trying some of their events online. And what was so great about donors didn't really have super high expectations. They were like, go for it. Boards of directors were saying, give it a try, we'll be there. So in 2020, organizations said, oh, I've never done this before. This is the first time we've really done it much online, but they tried it. One of my clients was fortunate enough to have a relationship with Jim Cuddy from Blue Rodeo. And he said, look, I'll do a few songs for you. So which was great. And just kind of put them on the map. But then we kind of quickly learned that after his few songs, people were like thinking this was going to be a full concert. Whoops, that wasn't really the intention. So it's learning. And I just want to, all of those people who were brave enough to try doing events. We did see many hospital foundations do phenomenally well through online forums. So it's always great to hear the successes that happened and people were willing to pivot along. A big area that grew during the pandemic for many organizations were 50-50 draws. I don't know if it brought out the gambling spirit in people, but organizations who did, whether it's catch the ace or 50-50s, were really able to pick up on the spirit. Maybe just we've all been closed in for too long and thought, okay, we're going to try getting a lottery ticket here. So yes, the draws, the online galas, or shifting your events to online, to just having 100 days of calling and reaching out to potential donors. So there's a few ideas for you.
It's interesting.
To add to that very quickly, I think one of the things, like, I think those are all phenomenal examples of how organizations innovated around working with donors and things like that. And the response of charities just broadly, it's just been so incredibly impressive. Like when we talk about this situation where the revenue has plummeted, the demand has increased, like how quickly they pivoted. It was just so impressive. Like Stats Canada survey asking businesses of all kinds, like what adjustments they were making early in the pandemic. And charities and nonprofits were the first to say like they were changing everything while others were still on the fence, because charities wanted to make sure that everyone they served had what they needed. And they were immediately in there, immediately doing things despite not knowing how they're going to pay for it. You know, their volunteers were being cut back, like, and they were doing everything they could to be able to actually continue to deliver services. And I mean, we can see so many different ways that, I mean, almost every charity said they added some sort of digital or virtual programming. 87% in the survey we did for Toronto Foundation of charities in Toronto said that they added some sort of new program or service. And I mean, when we look at that, I mean, whether it's mental health, education, you know, culture, recreation, you know, youth programming, every single one came up with these really creative adaptations to be able to continue to serve people in the midst of all this. And I think, like, you know, one of the things, like on the point of unrestricted funding, is so much of this would not have been capable if people are funding programs, or, you know, how many people you're going to have go through the doors. I mean, because the funding was able to pivot, like that's how they were able to innovate. And I think, like, you know, when we talk about, you know, often people talk about strategic philanthropy, they think about, you know, it excessively narrowed down into this idea that you fund, like, you know, a particular program for, you know, we really want to fund like a very specific thing, as opposed to, like, it's because these organizations had, you know, organizational funding that they were able to identify what needed to be done and just do it, and opposed to worrying about like, oh yeah, but we have to spend this money specifically on this and not, you know, not this, so we can't innovate. And I think, like, the organizations that responded most effectively were often ones that, like, they had the excess capacity to build plans for increasing. I mean, so Second Harvest, which is predominantly a Toronto-based organization, a year ago, like, expanded nationally over the course of about 3 months. And like, I think one of the things they told me when I talked to them for one of the reports I wrote was, like, they were planning on rolling that plan out over 5 years, and they did it over 3 months, which I think is, you know, incredibly profoundly challenging. But like, the thing is, they had the resources before that to come up with plans and develop them. And I don't think, you know, if organizations aren't funded to do these, like, these core planning exercises and things like that, or they aren't able to do that and pivot their money, like, they're not going to be able to do the innovation that's needed when we see crises of any sort.
It's almost getting ready, preparing for what could be from a possibility, both opportunity and, in this case, crisis. It's been so encouraging, though, to see how organizations have been able to pivot and still serve their constituents with that demand that rose, as you spoke of earlier, Stephen. It really is. It's just been I've been awestruck by what we're seeing so many of the grassroots organizations able to do. At this juncture, allow me to call out our almost talk radio style, if you will. I would like to ask our chair, Helen Seibel, who's been monitoring the chat room for us beautifully, if there's any questions coming in from our attendees that strike you as something that will continue our conversation, or maybe align to the conversation that we're having now, Helen. So go. It's almost like going to the producer. Going to the chair. What are you seeing there, Helen?
So there are definitely questions coming in from a few different people, and some of them are related to the questions you're discussing right now. So what I think I'll do is ask one around from Peel Children's Aid Society that's come in. What are the best ways to approach millennials and Generation Z for funding during the COVID-19 pandemic? So it's kind of like a more specific build on what Karen was just speaking about.
Karen, do you want to give that a whirl or?
Sure. I mean, ideally, we know that our millennials are not going to be our highest level donors, but what a perfect opportunity to get people engaged and to do something. So we know that millennials kind of like the campaign approach when it comes to like Kickstarter, GoFundMe. So if there's a specific need that you think would be of potential interest to the millennials, could you kind of do one of those, here's our immediate need, by the end of 2 weeks, we would like to be at this total, where their $50 or $25 is going to make a difference. So making it a project that's manageable, having a goal that's achievable, but that it also has impact on the agency as well, and is going to make a difference for you. So really try to break it down and build that sense of accomplishment.
If I could add two things really quickly there is like, I think one of the things we've seen from the research I've done is that millennials have been very hard hit. So when we look at unemployment, and Gen Z as well, like youth unemployment soared to levels like we've never seen before in this country. It improved a little bit, but like there's some real challenges there. Same time as millennials and youth are sort of faced with the same challenges more broadly in society of huge inequality. Like there's been a lot of millennials, particularly highly educated homeowning ones, who have investment portfolios that have done better than they've ever done before. And so like I think a lot of those people are very appreciative of how well they've done and are very open to giving. And there's others who really are struggling to pay their rent or, you know, buy healthy food. So I think, you know, sometimes people are like, oh, should we target millennials or not? Because, you know, we know that they're doing well, or sorry, doing poorly, relatively speaking, in the pandemic. But like everyone else, like there is a relatively small group, about 25% of them, that have done very well. And I think like there's just, you have to be cognizant in any group that there's can be a lot of disparities within them. And like, you know, in terms of wealth creation, there is definitely a small group of millennials that has done like better during the pandemic than ever before in their lives.
Interesting when you start to think about specific cohorts and how you engage them, as well as how you serve them, I would think. Andrea, do you also find that from a community foundations, when you're out talking to those numerous grassroots foundations, is there a sense from the millennial cohort of engagement or activity or a desire to be involved?
Sure, absolutely. Yes, is the answer. And I think there's lots of incredible programs that are not just about engaging through donations, but engaging through solutions and ideas. So going back to my previous point about shifting power, I think in part, people are looking for holistic engagement, not just a transaction. And so if we can shift from some of these transactional approaches that we've had into transformational approaches that are accelerated, that have long-term sustainable change associated with them, I think that's the magic spot that people are looking for, in particular through that generation. We had an incredible program with RBC that was called the RBC Future Launch Community Challenge. And that was all about asking young people to come to the table with their ideas and solutions for the needs that are existing in their community. And now we're funding those through community foundations across the country. And so I think that's a really important element to how we engage people in the same way that we like to be engaged, or I like to be engaged. It's not just about that transaction. It's really building that just, sustainable, bright future that we've been talking about together.
Yes, I like the together part. Yeah, I'm known to talk a lot of co-creation. Helen, is there anything else coming in that might be interesting for our panel to examine and explore at this juncture?
There is one other question I wondered about. I was for Andrea, that was related to her comments about the shift in power. Andrea, you mentioned the need to share and shift power to reimagine systems and create more resilient systems, but we're curious to know where policy might play in here. Like, does there need to be changes in policy related to this sector to kind of create that systems change?
That's a really great question. And the short answer is, again, yes, absolutely. It's that holistic approach. So a few things that I would point out. One of the experiences of COVID-19 that is connected to shifting power is the barriers that exist within philanthropy when it comes to supporting organizations that are at the grassroots or that are nonprofits. I'm sure there are many of those on the call today. And through foundations, the government regulates that foundations need to provide funding to something that's called a qualified donee. And a qualified donee, they do amazing things in community, but they aren't the only ones who are social purpose organizations who are doing incredible things and who are supporting their community. And so if we were to have a conversation about changing a policy, what about changing language about the ways in which foundations can flow money? If they could flow money to a broader cross sector of community, I think that would be transformational in not only getting more money out the door, but getting more money out the door to a broader range of organizations who are doing good in community. So that would be one that I think is tremendously important for us to focus in on as we go forward. There are many others that I could talk about, but if I have to pick one, that's the one.
One thing in our Toronto Foundation's Fallout report, we talked about mutual aid groups, which are typically one form of unqualified donee. And Toronto really led the way in these groups helping respond to the pandemic. An Ontario Nonprofit Network did a survey of their membership and found that nowhere more than in Toronto more than anywhere else in Ontario, organizations were flowing funds to mutual aid groups to ensure that people in local communities were actually getting the food, resources, money, whatever isolation support that they need. And so I think like in Toronto in particular, these have been shown to be incredibly important because I think, it's such a big place. These local groups play an utterly, unparalleled role in that, a giant, citywide organization can't respond to the needs in local communities and neighborhoods the way that these local mutual aid groups are. And so many folks that we talked to were again reporting like they had, there are ways to direct resources to mutual aid groups, but it's so much more complicated than it may need to be because of what Andrea was talking about.
Stephen, on that vein, I guess, when we had chatted a little bit about the public policy conditions that you think through your examination of the area and the different reports that foster the charitable sector, particularly when you think of in the midst of COVID and post-COVID. What are some of those conditions and perhaps multi-stakeholder collaboration that have to come together?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that's really critical to note for the charitable sector is that the vast majority of funding for charities broadly comes from government, federal, provincial, and municipal, with the majority coming from provincial government. When you look at how much debt and deficits are being added across all levels of government, I mean, it's getting closer to it. By the end of this, it's likely to get closer to $1 trillion than $1 billion. And I think there's a really, really big concern for the nonprofit and charitable sector over the next decade is eventually governments at various levels are going to come in with mandates to reduce deficits, pay down debt, all these sorts of things. And so I think like what the government needs to do now is focus on what are the different opportunities to be able to build long-term capacity so that organizations can fund themselves. So I think like, before the pandemic, there's a lot of focus on what the government can do to fund like social enterprises and social finance and stuff like that. And what we look at, like social enterprises are among the hardest hit area of the charitable sector broadly. I mean, and overall, like charities get more revenue from selling goods and services than they do from philanthropy. So I think like this is a really critical aspect that, and those social enterprises are the hardest hit, whether it's, the arts gallery selling tickets, the festivals that have sponsorships and tickets, and the health and fitness centers selling memberships, the childcare facilities selling or paying for fees, the educational institutions charging students tuition, like all these sorts of things. Like I think the government really should be thinking about how can they help organizations build the capacity to do more funding for themselves, because they can build that funding in now. 3-4 years from now, who knows who will be in charge at various levels of government. So the more like self-sufficiency they can bring and help us build those sort of essential revenue streams, I think it's really critical. Obviously it's hard, especially now, but when these things have been devastated, the more capital you have available to reopen, the easier it's going to be. And so if the government can figure out ways to reduce risk for people to reopen and effectively scale back up to even just where they were before, I think that will be a critical And so, yeah, I would say, like, on the public policy side, anything where you can put things in place that are going to have long-term benefits, whether that also be infrastructure change in tax policy that might make it easier to donate to charities for certain groups or things like that. I mean, these are things that you can put in place now, and, it's harder for, future governments that may have different priorities to change them.
And I guess at the root of that is that sustainability. So building today for sustain tomorrow, and then that enabling of capacity. Karen and Andrea, any further commentary on that when it comes to the conditions that we all want to work together to create? Is there anything that kind of sparks for you some thinking around how do we create those conditions that can be sustained for tomorrow and taken forward?
Sure, and kind of building, like Stephen was talking about the importance of looking at various different revenue streams. And I would encourage charities when thinking about their philanthropic revenue, even though it's only typically one component of their overall budget, it's one of the key messages we highlighted in our big rethink about the COVID pandemic and the effect on this sector was the importance of having a balanced portfolio. So making sure we think about those organizations, and there's many national health organizations who were heavily dependent on events. And it kept saying, having worked with many of them, oh yeah, after we get through this run, Karen, we're going to think about that shouldn't make up 80% of our revenues coming in. Yeah, we do have to get our minds to it. The silver lining of the pandemic is that it caused every charity to go, okay, we can't be totally dependent on events. And I know we have participants today from our various service clubs. And I know the hit that many of the service clubs would have taken this year with not being able to do their own events, and the funds of which go to help charities. So looking at balanced solutions. The other key piece is that individuals are still so critical. So keeping those conversations going with top donors. Individuals want to help, so don't underestimate the potential of that portfolio, as some of your events might be declining, some of your sustained giving, people might be just still giving at the same level, not upgrading their gifts, but really looking at where are the opportunities and having a nice balanced portfolio and the number of strategies related to your philanthropic activity.
Really about options, isn't it? And seeding those options. Andrea, I know that you as well have given quite a bit of thought to the conditions and both from a public policy perspective, and you mentioned earlier transformation. Like Stephen and Karen, some thoughts when you think about tomorrow and how we might transform and sustain.
Sure. I have lots of thoughts.
Just a little question.
I know we only have 10 minutes left. So I think the thing that I feel is really important and has been missing, and to be honest, it's missing in a lot of conversations, and that's the humans who are behind the charitable organizations, the nonprofit organizations, the grassroots organizations, the people who are on this call. And I think that sometimes we run on adrenaline and we run on the joy that we get from doing good work in the community. And we've been doing that for a really long time. And we've been doing it in a heightened way over the last year. And I think that there's a moment when we have to pause and we have to talk about personal resilience, and we have to talk about the fatigue that is very real across community, not only fatigue from the lockdowns and being in the gray zone or the red zone or the orange zone, or homeschooling or working from home. We're talking about what it means when every single day you are on the front lines of an organization who is working with people who are experiencing vulnerability. That is hard. And I know we can do hard things. Lots of people talk about it, but I think that we don't give it the proper amount of thinking, of space to actually ask people, how are you? The number of times that I have had conversations where I'm intentional about asking the question, how are you? And the answer is, well, my organization is doing okay. We have more demand for our services. We're going to hustle. We're going to find it. And that matters, but that's not the question I asked. The question I asked was, how are you as a leader, as an individual. How are you sleeping? How are you eating? How are you ensuring that you are sustainable so that you can build and be part of building a sustainable future? And I don't have the answer to what we should do about rejuvenation and the resilience of our leaders. But I think it's so important to acknowledge the people who are behind this and the way in which the sector contributes, the way it is building back better, and the people who are at the heart of that. So I just don't want to lose that in this important conversation, that the people matter a lot.
And
One thing I want just to build on Andrea's point really quickly. We surveyed nonprofit leaders in Toronto as part of the work for Toronto Foundation, and we asked people how burned out they were. And the level of burnout people are experiencing, like particular leader in the nonprofit sector, was just stunningly high. I mean, about 40% of leaders reported they were on some sort of edge of burnout, either current or very close to being burned out. And like that's the sort of level that, in a normal environment would be considered like a crisis level. Like the healthcare field in a normal situation has much actually lower burnout rates than that. And that's, one of their biggest areas in like their human resource literature of how to cope with burnout. So I think like the human element of what's happened for so many folks is such a critical piece. And like the other piece we saw is the more organizations were worried about, or the leaders were worried about the sustainability of the organization, the more burned out they were. We also saw that women were particularly likely to report high levels of burnout, which I think, so many of them are taking on such huge responsibilities at home while trying to also like shepherd organizations. And I think like these sorts of pieces are really critical to acknowledge as well, is that, this pivoting, this constant pivot of, change, find new ways to deliver services, find new ways to get money. Like this is exhausting, even under the best of circumstances, let alone, this.
It's interesting and so important to hold that almost dear, isn't it? The burden in the face of trying to sustain and be resilient, and going back to the individual and that truly human experience, we forget. And it's so nice that you brought that up, Andrea, and to remind us to stop and take that moment to talk to one another in a very intimate and meaningful way. We are getting close to the close of our hour. Gosh, that's been going fast. I think we probably have enough time, I would say, for one more question from the floor before we close for the day. I can't believe how quickly this goes when we're having such inspired conversations. Helen, is there another question that maybe can be our closing comment, or are they all kind of, I'm seeing them go by and go, these are like heavy questions for our panelists. We could do 3 more hours with you, gang.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to look at one that might be appropriate to ask, and perhaps I'll choose this one. Just any ideas from the panelists around how a corporation can help a nonprofit organization in transitioning to become more of a social enterprise to bring more sustainability to their community work. So any ideas or examples you've seen that might be helpful?
I interviewed
30 seconds or less.
I interviewed a number of leaders on that topic, and I see Andrea had her hand up, so I'll talk very quickly. We talked to a number of leaders from companies about that for a report for Imagine Canada. You can read more in the report. I'll link it. But basically, I think a lot of big leaders of companies were telling us that like they were often surprised that people weren't being more proactive in coming to them with things. Like I think they were open to it, but I think so many folks were like weren't sure if that was going to be something they would fund. That I think a number of folks told us that like they were open and interested in seeing more opportunities. And I will pass maybe to Andrea, who seemed to have a great idea for that.
So more opportunities for social enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Andrea.
Yeah, I just want to point out the Investment Readiness Program and the stories that are coming through the Investment Readiness Program. This is a $50 million investment from the Government of Canada in social purpose organizations, social enterprise organizations, all in the preparation for the Social Finance Fund. And so IRP it has been going for 2 years. Last week, CFC, alongside community foundations, just announced the second round of funding for that. But if you're curious about ideas, and if you need a little bit of a dose of hope, read the stories of these organizations who are doing incredible things to scale their impact, to support their community. And it's all rooted in building back better.
And I just kind of add, like, this is a time for even the smallest of organizations to be bold. get the story out. People want to hear your story and want to help. So keep that in mind in your planning and strategies.
I like that. Bold, courage, all of these strong words that we're hearing today, resilience. Thank you. We are now at our 2-minute mark. Would like to take this moment to thank you, panelists, for an inspired conversation. You have given us all so much to think about and so much to read. I have to say, you have to link all of these links from books to articles. I can't wait. I love reading, and I'm going to be juiced this weekend. So thank you. It was an hour that went too fast, and we could have spent many more hours on all of these topics. They're very intriguing. Also, thank you to all of you for coming and joining us today. Really appreciate your time, your energy, your chat, your questions. A shout out to our sponsor, Leith Wheeler, the Investment Council, and also would ask all of you to stay tuned for our next vital conversation in the series. We will be sending additional information coming soon to you. So on that, we are at our noon mark, and thank you all so much. Thank you, Helen, for bringing in the talk radio kind of element. Really love that. And of course, all the gang there at the Community Foundation of Mississauga for the fabulous job you did pulling all of this together. Thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.
Thanks, Tara.
Bye now. Bye, panelists. Thank you so much.
Bye.